In the late 20th century, South Africa began a tremendous transformation. From about 1950 until 1994, the country's large and diverse non-white population was legally dominated by the white minority in nearly every sphere of life. South Africa had an institutionalized policy of racial segregation and economic and political discrimination against its black, mixed race, and Asian citizens. This policy became known as apartheid, an Afrikaans word that means apartness. Area 471,359 square miles, 1,220,813 square kilometers. Population, 2020 est. 59,750,000. After a long struggle, pressure from the anti-apartheid movement within the country and international censure, economic sanctions, and boycotts convinced the government to begin easing some of the apartheid laws in the mid-1980s. A new administration repealed the remainder of the discriminatory laws in the early 1990s. The election of a black president in 1994 began a new era in the country's history. South Africa has three capitals. Pretoria is the executive capital, Bloemfontein the judicial capital, and Cape Town the legislative capital. Land and climate. South Africa is bordered by Namibia to the northwest, Botswana and Zimbabwe to the north, and Mozambique and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, to the northeast and east. Lesotho, an independent country, is entirely surrounded by South African territory. South Africa's coastlines border the Indian Ocean to the southeast and the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest. South Africa is the southernmost part of the African continent, one of the oldest and most stable of Earth's landmasses. The rock underlying most of the country, called the Karoo system, is at least 200 million years old. This stability explains why there are no high, folded, mountain ranges, formed by folding of the continental crust, such as the Rockies, the Andes, and the Himalayas. The only fold mountains are in the southern tip, near Cape Town. Most of the country is a saucer-like plateau. The plateau slopes downward from elevations of more than 8,000 feet, 2,400 meters, in east to about 2,000 feet, 600 meters, into the west. The central part of the plateau, called the Highveld, reaches between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, 1,200 and 1,800 meters, in elevation. A mountainous ridge called the Great Escarpment separates the plateau from a narrow coastal strip. Running from the northeast to the southwest, it features scenery of great beauty. The Drakensberg, a range within the Great Escarpment, rises to heights of more than 11,000 feet, 3,400 meters, along the border between KwaZulu-Natal Province and Lesotho. Jinsuthi, at 11,181 feet, 3,408 meters, is the country's highest point. Smaller mountain ranges south of the escarpment are separated by dry basins called the Great Karoo and the Little Karoo. The sandy Kalahari Desert occupies the northernmost part of northern Cape Province. South Africa has few perennial rivers and no significant natural lakes. Parts of even the largest rivers, the Orange, the Vaal, the Limpopo, and the Tugela, dry up when rainfall is scarce. Water supplies for both town and country must be carefully planned. Hundreds of dams have been built on all major rivers. Two of the largest dams are on the Upper Orange River, the Gariep and the Van der Kloof. They are part of the Orange River Project, a series of dams, canals, and tunnels that stores and distributes water for irrigation and provides hydroelectric power. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project supplies water to Gauteng Province, South Africa's industrial center, and produces hydroelectric power for Lesotho. Almost all of South Africa lies within the temperate climate zone, and extremes of heat and cold are rare. Because of the country's generally high elevation, even the tropical and near-tropical northern areas are much cooler than would be expected based on their latitude. The climate is strongly influenced by the oceans that surround the country on three sides. Along the Atlantic coast, the cold, northward flowing Benguela current cools the air and thus causes fog. The warm Agulhas current sweeps southward along the east and southeast coasts, bringing higher temperatures from KwaZulu-Natal to Eastern Cape and Western Cape. Most of the country is dry, though the east receives more rainfall than the west. Plants and animals. Grasses cover much of South Africa. The central Highveld is dominated by tall red grass, named for its color in winter, with scattered trees. The dry savanna of the north favors red grass and other drought-resistant grasses, with acacia and baobab trees. As rainfall decreases to the west, There are thorny trees, then thin grasses and scrub bushes, and ultimately the sparsely covered Kalahari Desert and the bare Namib Desert. In the southwest, Western Cape Province has a distinct vegetation of grasses, shrubs, and trees able to withstand the long, dry summers. This region is home to many of South Africa's 20,000 species of flowering plants. For at least 2,000 years the country's natural vegetation has been altered through human settlement, agriculture, and the introduction of foreign species. East of the Great Escarpment, subtropical forests have been displaced by grassland, farmland, and exotic trees, such as wattle and eucalyptus. Natural forest survives only in mountainous valleys along the Great Escarpment and in a few other places, in particular the Knysna area of the southern coast. South Africa is rich in the wild animal life of the Old World. Among its more than 200 mammal species are lions, leopards, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, zebras, baboons, and many kinds of antelope. Smaller animals include mongooses, jackals, and various cats, such as the caracal. The number of animals plummeted, however, during the 18th and 19th centuries, when white settlement expanded. Many animals were killed by hunters, and others had their habitats destroyed. Today the country's large mammals live mainly in national parks and wildlife reserves. The largest is Kruger National Park. People and culture. The South African population rose steadily over the last quarter of the 20th century, increasing from some 27 million in 1985 to more than 41 million by 1996. By the late 1990s, however, the incidence of AIDS began to rise, limiting population growth. Most South Africans live in the eastern half of the country and along the southern coast. Ethnic groups and languages. Blacks make up about 4/5 of the population. They belong to a number of ethnic groups that are defined by their languages. Almost all South African blacks speak Bantu languages, but within this large group are 4 main subgroups. The largest is the Nguni, which includes the Zulu, Swazi, Ndebele, and Xhosa peoples. The second largest is the Sotho Sawana, including the Sotho, Pedi, and Sawana. The other 2 primary language groups are the Venda speakers, made up mainly of the Venda peoples, and the Sangha, or Shangaan, speakers, mainly the Sangha peoples. 9 Bantu languages are among the country's 11 official languages. The country's original peoples, the Khokho and San, spoke Khoisan languages. After centuries of intermarriage with other groups, the Khokho and San barely exist as separate peoples in South Africa. The country's largest ethnic minorities are whites and people of mixed race. Most whites belong to one of 2 language groups: speakers of Afrikaans, a language developed in South Africa from Dutch, and speakers of English. The Afrikaners, those who speak Afrikaans, are the descendants of mostly Dutch, French, and German settlers who began to migrate to South Africa in the mid-17th century. The English speakers are descended mainly from British colonists. Both English and Afrikaans are official languages. South Africa's mixed-race population is a result of intermarriage between the Khokho and the San, Bantu-speaking Africans, slaves imported from Madagascar and what are now Malaysia and Indonesia, and whites. In many respects they cannot be distinguished culturally or physically from the white population. A few mixed-race groups, however, have managed to maintain distinct identities. Among them are the Malays, who largely originated from Indonesian Muslim slaves, and the Griquas, who trace their origins to a specific Khokho community. Under apartheid, South Africans of mixed race were collectively classified as colored. While some Malays and Griquas have continued to call themselves colored, others who were so classified have rejected the label. Most mixed-race South Africans live in the southwest and speak Afrikaans or, to a lesser extent, English. Asians make up South Africa's 3rd significant minority. They are mostly of Indian descent. Many Indian South Africans are descended from indentured laborers brought to the former natal colony to work the sugar plantations in the mid-19th century. They largely speak English, though many also use their mother tongues, Hindi, Gujarati, Tamil, Urdu, and Telugu. Most Indian South Africans live in KwaZulu-Natal province. A small Chinese community is descended from indentured laborers brought to work in the gold mines of the Transvaal in the early 20th century. Religion. The predominant religion in South Africa is Christianity. A large number of people follow independent African Christian churches, which vary in size from a few to millions of members. These faiths combine aspects of traditional African religions with Christian beliefs. Several traditional Christian denominations, including the Methodist, Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Dutch Reformed churches, also have large followings. The other major religions are Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. Education. The right to a basic education is guaranteed in South Africa's constitution. Education is compulsory for all children from ages 7 to 15 or through 9th grade, whichever is reached first. Instruction begins in one of the 11 official languages. After 2nd grade, students begin learning another language. South Africa's education system includes private and public schools. During the apartheid era, schools run by white education departments had the best resources in the public school system, and white-oriented private schools received substantial public funds. Although the school system is no longer legally segregated, informal white resistance, capacity limitations, and fees generally have kept blacks out of historically white public schools. Private schools remain inaccessible to most blacks because of the high cost. In an effort to rectify past inequalities, post-apartheid governments pledged significant resources toward improving schools in previously neglected areas. South Africa has more than 20 universities. The oldest and largest is the University of South Africa, UNISA, established in Cape Town but now in Pretoria. It provides distance education, or correspondence courses, in both English and Afrikaans. Apartheid laws led to the development of historically white and historically black universities and technikons, or technical schools. Even after the end of apartheid, schools remained largely segregated, and professional and postgraduate courses were still concentrated at the formerly white universities. In the early 21st century, the government restructured the higher education system, consolidating universities and technikons in an effort to improve the access to and quality of education for all students. Major cities. Until the 1860s, all South African towns were small. The largest, Cape Town, had a population of fewer than 40,000 in 1865. Urbanization accelerated rapidly from the 1870s as a result of railway building, mining, and economic expansion. By the turn of the 20th century, the population of the Cape Town metropolitan area had reached 130,000. Meanwhile, Johannesburg, which was established in 1886, had already surpassed it in size. Continued rapid growth since the early 20th century has created 4 major urban concentrations. The largest by far centers on Johannesburg. It also includes Pretoria, the industrial center of Ekurhuleni, East Rand, and Soweto, the country's largest black urban complex. The others are centered on Durban, Cape Town, and the Port Elizabeth Uitenhage area. South African cities took on a characteristic form during the apartheid era. The Group Areas Act of 1950 divided cities into racially segregated residential and business sections. The most favorable areas were reserved for whites, while more peripheral areas, called townships, were set aside for non-whites. Soweto was the largest of the townships. The Group Areas Act was repealed in 1991, but the racially defined settlement patterns in the cities persist. All South African cities show great disparities of income and access to services between the wealthiest, predominantly white areas and the poorest, exclusively black districts. Economy. The economy of South Africa was transformed by the discovery of diamonds in 1867 and then of gold in 1886. The mining industry attracted foreign investment and provided South Africa with valuable exports. In the 20th century, government support and 2 world wars stimulated the growth of manufacturing, which eventually overtook mining in productivity. Then, beginning in the 1970s, services became predominant. Agriculture, fishing, and forestry only slightly more than 1/10 of the country is arable. Nevertheless, agriculture is an important source of jobs and accounts for a significant portion of exports. The major crops include corn, maize, wheat, sugarcane, sorghum, peanuts, groundnuts, citrus and other fruits, potatoes, and tobacco. Grapes are grown and used to make outstanding wines. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs are raised for food and other products. Wool and meat, beef, lamb and mutton, and goat, are important. Dairy farming is especially significant near the cities. With warm waters along the east coast and very cold waters along the west coast, South Africa harvests a wide variety of fish and crustaceans. The coastal catch includes anchovy, pilchard, and herring. Hake, agula's sole, and kingklip are taken from the deep sea. Rock lobsters are harvested along the west and southeast coasts. Because South Africa is sparsely wooded, the government began planting millions of acres of trees after World War II. Today most of these plantation forests are privately owned. The most common trees grown for commercial purposes are eucalyptus, pine, and wattle, which are used in the construction, furniture, and pulp and paper industries. In rural areas wood is widely used for fuel. Industry. South Africa has some of the largest mineral reserves in the world. It is the world's leading producer of platinum and chromium and ranks among the leaders in gold and diamonds. The country also contains reserves of iron ore, manganese, copper, uranium, silver, beryllium, and titanium. There is very little petroleum, but some natural gas is produced off the southern coast. The main energy resource is coal, which is used to make most of the country's electricity and is also exported. South Africa's most important manufacturing industries include food processing and the production of metals and metal products, chemicals, and textiles. Agriculture and fisheries provide the basis for meat, fish, and fruit canning, sugar refining, and other food processing. Mining supplies raw materials for the metal industry, which is centered in Gauteng. The industry includes the production of iron and steel as well as finished goods, especially automobiles and machinery. Aluminum is produced using imported materials. The chemical industry began with the manufacture of explosives for use in mining. Today a petrochemical industry produces a wide range of plastics, resins, and industrial chemicals. Services. The dominant sector of South Africa's economy is services, which account for some 2/3 of both the gross domestic product and the workforce. The most important parts of this wide-ranging sector include finance, trade, tourism, and information technology. South Africa is highly dependent on foreign trade. Its main trading partners are the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, China, and Japan. Base and precious metals, including platinum, diamonds, gold, and iron and steel, are valuable exports. Agricultural goods and automobiles also are important. The country's major imports include machinery, petroleum, automobiles, and chemicals. Tourism became increasingly important to South Africa's economy after the end of apartheid. While the majority of tourists come from African countries, an increasing number of arrivals are from Europe and the Americas. Wildlife parks are among the most important tourist attractions. Transportation. South Africa's network of roads, railways, and air routes is the most extensive in Africa. Johannesburg and Durban are connected by a multi-lane highway. Most other cities and towns are connected by 2-lane highways. Railroad construction began in 1859 to connect the coast with the interior and gradually spread across the entire country. Transnet Limited, a government-owned company, controls freight rail. Metrorail, an agency of the Department of Transport, handles commuter services. South African Airways, the national carrier, and an increasing number of private competitors provide domestic and international air service. The main international airports serve Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. Transnet also owns and oversees South Africa's ports. Durban is the busiest port in Africa. Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, Richards Bay, Mossel Bay, Saldanha Bay, and Ngikura are the other major deepwater ports. Government. South Africa is a multi-party republic in which power is shared by the president and the bicameral legislature, or parliament. The lower house of parliament, the National Assembly, consists of 350 to 400 members who are elected by popular vote. The upper house, the National Council of Provinces, has 90 members who are elected by the 9 provincial legislatures. The president, chosen by the National Assembly from among its members, is the head of state and government. The judiciary operates independently of the president and the parliament. The Constitutional Court reviews laws to ensure that they are consistent with the Constitution. In matters not relating to the Constitution, the Supreme Court of Appeal is the highest court. Most cases are heard in the high courts or magistrates' courts. History. Some of the earliest ancestors of human beings lived in what is now South Africa 2.5 to 3 million years ago. The San people roamed the area as hunters and gatherers for thousands of years before some of them acquired livestock and became herders about 2,000 years ago. The herders called themselves Kokho, meaning men of men. About 1,800 years ago Bantu speakers from the north began settling in the region. They established villages and grew crops in addition to herding cattle and sheep. Most of the blacks living in South Africa today are descended from these people. European colonialism. In 1488, the Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias led the first European expedition to round the Cape of Good Hope. He was searching for an all-water route around Africa for trade with India and East Asia. Over the next century, numerous European ships made their way around the South African coast, but only shipwrecked crews made direct contact with the African peoples. From the early 17th century, both the British and the Dutch challenged Portuguese control of the Cape Sea route. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a settlement at Table Bay, now Cape Town, as a supply station for Dutch fleets. The Dutch settlers became known as Boers, meaning farmers in Dutch, and later as Afrikaners, for their Afrikaans language. The Boers grew wheat, tended vineyards, and raised sheep and cattle. They were aided by slaves brought in from West and East Africa, India, and the Malay Peninsula. Gradually the Boers moved farther inland, bringing them into conflict with the cocoa and the San. By the end of the 18th century, these Africans were defeated, either killed in warfare, forced to work on the colonists' farms, or pushed north into the desert. Meanwhile, intermarriage between the whites, cocoa, and slaves produced the ethnically mixed-colored people. The British seized the Cape settlement from the Dutch in 1795 and bought it outright from the Dutch in 1814. Thereafter, the British ruled the area as the Colony of the Cape of Good Hope, which became known simply as the Cape Colony. In the meantime, the earliest of a long-running series of frontier wars had broken out between the Boers and the Xhosa peoples. Constantly seeking new land, the Boers had turned eastward and had begun competing with the Xhosa for the cattle trade and water rights. In 1820, the British colonial government placed a buffer zone of British settlers between the Boers and the Xhosa. This move solidified British control over the colony but also raised tensions, as the new settlers competed for land with the Boers and the Xhosa. The Boers resented British policies, including the abolition of slavery in 1834 and low compensation for their emancipated slaves. In rebellion against British rule and in search of fresh pasturelands, about 13,000 Boers left Cape Colony during the 1830s and early 1840s. This migration is known as the Great Trek. They made their way north of the Orange River, frequently exchanging hostilities with local Bantu peoples. Eventually they founded the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which gained independence from the British in the 1850s. African states. After the 1760s, African societies were increasingly affected by ivory and slave traders operating in the northeast as well as by traders and raiders based in the Cape to the south. In response to these invasions, the farming communities banded together and created a number of states different in structure, scale, and military capacity from anything that had existed before. In the early 19th century, competition for land and natural resources, intensified by drought, led to unprecedented warfare among these states. The wars strengthened some states at the expense of others. Among the most successful African states to emerge from this period were the Pedi, led by Sekwati, the Swazi, led by Sabuza, the Sutu, led by Mashushu, the Ndebele, led by Mzilikazi, and the Zulu, led by Shaka. The African states sometimes traded with the colonists, but more often the communities fought over land. The Boers crushed the Ndebele in 1837. The Zulu and the Sutu had some success in repelling the Boers, but eventually they were overpowered. In the 1870s, the British colonial government redoubled its efforts to acquire the last fertile areas controlled by the weakened African states. By 1900, following a number of invasions, no independent African societies remained in the region. The conquered African peoples were forced to live on scattered rural reserves. Industry and imperialism. Diamonds were first discovered in South Africa in 1867, but richer finds in 1870 led to a large-scale diamond rush. Ignoring claims by the Boer republics, the British annexed the diamond fields in 1871. In 1877 they proclaimed the Transvaal Republic a British colony, but the Transvaal Boers fought and regained their independence in 1881. The world's largest goldfields were discovered near the site of present-day Johannesburg in 1886. The gold mining industry grew rapidly, and by 1899 South Africa produced almost 3/10 of the world's gold. The workforce consisted mainly of poorly paid black migrant workers housed in compounds by the mining companies. The gold discovery had brought a tremendous influx of miners and fortune seekers, primarily British and Germans. They were called Uitlanders, meaning outlander in Afrikaans. These foreigners eventually came to outnumber the Boers 2-1 in the Transvaal, but the Boer government refused to grant them voting and other rights. Tensions with Britain increased after an English adventurer, Leander Starr Jameson, led a botched raid into the Transvaal in 1895 in an attempt to provoke an Uitlander uprising. The Boers, determined to preserve their independence, began to arm themselves. In 1899, Boer forces invaded the British colony of Natal, starting the South African War, also called the Boer War. The Boer army surrendered in 1902 only after an intense guerrilla struggle. The Boer republics became British colonies. Segregation and Apartheid. Years of negotiations brought the four colonies, Cape, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange Free State, together as the Union of South Africa in 1910. The new constitution allowed each of the four former colonies to decide for itself whether blacks could vote. The Cape and Natal used requirements of property ownership to prevent the great majority of blacks from voting, while the Orange Free State and the Transvaal denied the vote to all blacks. Furthermore, only whites could be elected to the newly created national parliament. Aside from politics, segregation also became a distinctive feature of the social and economic life of South Africa. New laws reserved certain jobs for white workers and restricted blacks' access to cities. Almost 9/10 of South Africa, including the best land for agriculture and the bulk of the mineral deposits, was reserved exclusively for whites. Few blacks received an education, and black workers received only a fraction of the wages paid to whites. Resistance to these discriminatory policies was strong and immediate, especially among educated blacks. In 1912, middle-class blacks founded the South African Native National Congress to advocate for political rights. Later it was renamed the African National Congress, ANC. In the 1920s, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union and the Communist Party of South Africa began organizing protests among black workers. World War II, in which South Africa fought with the Allies, had a great impact on the country. Manufacturing overtook mining and agriculture in its contribution to the economy. Blacks flooded into the cities to fill the industrial jobs and formed trade unions. The government's brutal suppression of a 1946 strike by black mine workers further radicalized many African nationalists. After the strike, both the United Party government, led by Jan Smuts, and private companies introduced some reforms within the segregation framework. Among them were an increase in black wages and a relaxation of the pass laws, which restricted the right of blacks to live and work in white areas. Leading up to the 1948 national election, the opposition National Party opposed these concessions and took a strongly pro-white stance. The National Party used the word apartheid to describe a program of tightened segregation and discrimination. The National Party narrowly won the election. The new, all-white government passed many laws to legalize and institutionalize apartheid. These laws classified every South African by race, prohibited interracial marriage, removed blacks and colorids from the common vote as rolls, and divided all cities and towns into segregated residential and business zones called group areas. Thousands of colorids, blacks, and Indians were removed from areas classified for white occupation. Blacks were treated like tribal people and were required to live on reserves except when they worked temporarily in white towns or on white farms. The government consolidated the scattered reserves into territories called homelands or Bantustans. Millions of blacks were forcibly relocated from cities and white-owned farms into the homelands. Each homeland was put under the control of a chief who cooperated with the government. Eventually, the government encouraged the homelands to become independent. Between 1976 and 1981, 4 accepted independence: Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei, though none was ever recognized by a foreign government. All the homelands were overcrowded and very poor. In the meantime, the National Party pursued its goal of establishing South Africa as a republic. At a meeting of the Commonwealth countries in 1961, South Africa hoped to retain its status in the organization. When other members criticized it over its apartheid policies, however, it withdrew from the Commonwealth and became the Republic of South Africa. Resistance and the end of apartheid. The fight against apartheid was spearheaded by blacks in the ANC, but it also involved Indians, colorids, and sympathetic whites. The brutal government responses to protests in the black townships of Sharpeville, 1960, and Soweto, 1976, focused worldwide attention on South Africa. The United Nations denounced apartheid in 1973 and imposed an embargo on the export of arms to South Africa in 1977. Under P.W. Botha, who took power in 1978, the government made some reforms. Among other changes, it repealed the ban on interracial marriage and repealed the pass laws. A new constitution created separate legislatures for Indians and for Coloreds. The Botha reforms, however, stopped short of making any real change in the distribution of power. The white legislature could override the colored and Indian chambers, and all blacks remained disenfranchised. The struggle against apartheid intensified during the early 1980s, as strikes and boycotts escalated. In 1986, the government declared a nationwide state of emergency and set out to eliminate all opposition, destroying black squatter camps and detaining, abusing, and killing thousands of blacks. As these events unfolded, government officials held discussions with imprisoned ANC leader Nelson Mandela. Botha, who still resisted the idea of allowing blacks to participate in the political system, was forced to step down as both National Party leader and president in 1989. He was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, who set about dismantling the apartheid system. In 1990-91, Parliament repealed the basic apartheid laws, lifted the state of emergency, freed many political prisoners, and allowed exiles to return to South Africa. South Africa after apartheid. Mandela, freed after 27 years in prison, was elected president of the ANC in 1991. He and de Klerk held negotiations over a proposed new constitution that would enfranchise the black majority and lead to all-race national elections. In 1993, the ANC and the National Party reached agreement on a peaceful transition to majority rule. The country's first election by universal suffrage, held in April 1994, was won handily by the ANC. The National Party came in second. Mandela was sworn in as president of the new South Africa on May 10, with de Klerk as one of two deputy presidents. A new constitution, adopted in 1996, emphasized equality and human rights. In the early 21st century, the ANC kept its firm hold on power, though the party was racked by infighting among its leaders. The presidents who succeeded Mandela faced steep challenges, including high crime rates, ethnic tensions, great disparities in housing and educational opportunities, and the AIDS pandemic. You can subscribe to support our channel and turn on the notification bell to be notified of new videos.